To examine the subject of paranormality from a cultural lens, this time through the lens of mainstream academia, this is Neon Galactic. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. Typically on this show, as most of you likely know, we engage in an exploration of strangeness, of rejected knowledge, and what those subjects may tell us about human identity, missed opportunities, potential growth, and the limits of old paradigms. Today's conversation is coming from a different, more challenging direction. Our guest is Derek Lee, an assistant professor of English from Wake Forest University, and we're here to discuss his new book, Parascientific Revolutions, The Science and Culture of the Paranormal. This volume dives into the paranormal subject from the perspective of mainstream academia and has several important takeaways about how the subject perseveres despite being rejected over and over again by cultural authorities who deride such possibilities. Its status as a kind of renegade philosophy affords it some power and makes the study of its longevity important and relevant for epistemological purposes. Lee's book covers a swath of paranormal cultural highlights, from the Stargate program at Stanford Research Institute to Darryl Ben's parapsychological studies that seemed to so rattle academia a few short years ago. We'll discuss the book, the status of paranormal and other rejected knowledge in our broader culture, and how power and its authorities always seem to play a role in what's accepted and what stands rejected. Thanks for joining us, Derek.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start with who you are. Derek Lee, you're an assistant professor at Wake Forest. Typically what's your interest and what do you teach at Wake Forest, and how did you end up on this subject?
That's a good question. So, as you mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of English at Wake Forest University, and I generally teach classes broadly across 20th and 21st century fiction. And my areas of focus in the last couple of years have been Asian American literature, speculative fiction, which includes both science fiction and fantasy. I've been doing a lot of graphic novel work. And my own training is in what is called science and technology studies, also known as STS in the field. And the way I got into this project, I'm not sure if you want the long answer or the short answer, um, but a lot of this came from my graduate work when I was at Penn State. And I guess I'll give you the long version.
Yeah, I'll take it. I like it.
I was in a Ulysses, I'm not sorry, I was in a James Joyce seminar, and I was reading we were studying Ulysses, and there's a really famous chapter called Circe, where the two main characters, Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus, are in conversations with each other in this drama. And for some reason, they know things about each other's lives that they shouldn't have access to. And I came across a really fascinating article that said that this has to be construed as a mental exchange between two people. And the reason how I know this is because James Joyce knew about the Society for Psychical Research. And so
Yeah.
I was in graduate school. I didn't know what the Society for Psychical Research was, so I started looking around this group. And I'm not sure if your listeners know what SPR is, but it was a Victorian society that tried to understand the scientific principles around paranormal phenomena, ghosts, telepathy, clairvoyance. And when I found about that, my head kind of exploded, and I said, I need to study this in greater detail. So that
And there's
is
some
the long
fascinating names
story.
who were, sorry, but there were some fascinating names associated with SPR, right? Like big Arthur Conan Doyle was part of
Mhm.
that. Yeah, there's a lot of people who were Frank Myers, although was that the American? I'm not
Well,
sure, but
Frederick Myers was
Frederick
one of the
Myers, yeah.
major thinkers, but William James, the
William James,
famous
yeah, yeah.
the father of American psychology, he was a member of SPR. Arthur Conan Doyle. There's a whole slew of writers involved with this organization. So it was really prestigious, really wide-ranging, and it gave me kind of access to both like a literary and scientific history of the paranormal. And so that was kind of uh, how I got interested into the weird aspects of scientific history.
Yeah. So what would you say was your mission in taking on this book? I mean, you're kind of charting how it's grown and survived and thrived and different moments was and different kind of places in the cultural, debate. So how did you go from, that interest in, SPR to really taking on the full, granularity of this complicated subject?
Yeah, so just to give readers a preview, so basically, Parascientific
Yeah, yeah.
Revolutions,
Sorry.
I would describe it as a cultural and theoretical history of the paranormal. And it covers like the full gamut of paranormal history with a strong focus on the second half of the 20th century. And so the reason I'd say the mission behind writing this book is maybe twofold. The first is I think the history of the paranormal is just super fascinating. It is so rich and complex, and most people don't know about it. And I want to share like all these cool things that I learned with people. And so even though it is an academic text, I tried to write it as in an in an accessible manner as possible. Because I think that there are wider reading publics that would appreciate learning about just the weird, ways that the paranormal has evolved over the past 50, 60 years. I think the second reason or the second mission behind writing this book is to start a conversation about the paranormal in the academy. And I think it's already happening in some places. I know that in the past you've spoken with Jeffrey Kripal, and he's done an
Yeah.
amazing job of kind of talking about paranormal discourse in at least in his field of religion, and it's moving elsewhere. But I guess in the areas that I work in, specifically in English literature, as well as in science studies, the paranormal is not really discussed all that much. In English literature, the paranormal comes up mostly with like late Victorian, early modernist periods, insofar that there was all this occult stuff happening around the birth of well, I guess like around the time the mind start being studied. There was a lot of interest about how is how is occult stuff and maybe like occult stuff with the mind happening with early 20th century. But that kind of tailed off, as psychical research and parapsychology kind of winded down over the course of the 20th century. But I guess a lot of my research showed that paranormal ideas are constantly evolving, and I wanted to look at what's happening afterwards. And at the same time, in science studies, science and technology studies looks at a lot of mainstream sciences. So we're talking about physics, psychology, climate change, and paranormal science is not really discussed all that much. And again, if it does come up, it's usually involved with some of the occult ideas that bubbled up around the end of the 19th, early 20th century. And again, so much of my research showed that there are new areas where the paranormal is being, I guess, re-engaged. And
Yeah.
this involves like quantum physics, it involves
Yeah.
neurology, systems biology, cartography. All this stuff is like re-informing how we think about the paranormal. And just going back to literature, the paranormal is not just stuck around modernist literature, because certainly, as we mentioned, Arthur Conan Doyle, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, all of these authors were highly engaged with the paranormal. But then, at least the academic study kind of tails off around there. And I started looking at new literary genres like science fiction, ethnic
Yeah. Yeah.
fiction. Let's like start looking more broadly. Let's look at government training manuals because like the paranormal there are government programs around the paranormal.
Yeah.
Let's also look at kind of like psychic manuals that are really popular in like certain like new age groups and just like people who are interested in the paranormal. So there's a lot of literature out there that we haven't looked at that I think is just so interesting and that more academics ought to take a look at.
It's interesting. I think that for some folks, there might be a distinction or need some clarity here. English majors are typically looked at as people who like to read good books, like fiction, like the classics. But the English major, if I'm not mistaken, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I was an English major, but it was a long time ago. But there was an evolution going on even then where it became more of a kind of a cultural criticism, where it was like about examining texts to see, kind of the power that they demonstrate in our culture and what it's saying about our society at the time that it's written, or and there's various schools for how you might critique certain written works, but it's not just about flowery language and studying Shakespeare. It's about examining our cultural milieu through text, right? Was that fair to say?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think like the discipline has certainly changed. I think like there will always be a place for Shakespeare. Shakespeare is amazing.
Yeah.
Um, but certainly like the fields have changed and what is considered canon has changed. And I know simply English literature needs to talk to the people, and that's why classes on comics, on science fiction, on popular romance, and these are classes that fill and they also have smart things to say about what's happening in the culture. What are the scientific developments that people are fascinated with and have ethical conundrums that we want to wrestle with via fiction. It's a great way to connect as students with contemporary politics, with what's happening with screen time and our attentions and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think like the if you haven't like looked at what's happening in English departments recently, I think it's really fascinating to see what is being talked about because it is anything and everything at this point.
Yeah. That sort of brings me to one of the topics I wanted to kind of get your to hear you riff on. Um, it's interesting, like you talk about the canon in literature and how it's evolved over time. And there was a time when the canons were all the old white dudes, as they would say in the in the hallways of school or whatever. There'd be like the Shakespeare's and all the folks, Robert Frost, that have traditionally been taught and learned in school. That's opened up hugely over the past 40 years, maybe even more, where like African American lit and just all of those things have sort of opened up, and students I think are exposed to a much broader swath of what's considered important literature to study. I wanted to ask you about how that relates to the pseudoscience versus regular science kind of debate. Like, in your book, you use the term pseudoscience, but you're also very sort of sensitive to the fact that that has a negative connotation. And so I wonder, how much do you think power has to do with both of those kinds of determinations? Obviously, some pseudoscience is bunk because it's been absolutely disproven, but some pseudoscience, the questions kind of lie in this middle space where it hasn't been proven or really disproven, although people may argue about that. There has been no hard or fast answers, but it still gets labeled as a pseudoscience because the institutional powers that be have chosen to reject that particular line of thinking. Can you talk about how that might relate to how canon formation happens in literature programs and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so that's a multi-part question. I'll start with the main part about pseudoscience. So pseudoscience is a large part of what I was thinking about in this book. It's kind of funny because early on when I was coming up with this project, I told people that I was going to be writing about pseudoscience, and I got a lot of quizzical looks, like, "Are you sure that's a good idea?" And
I
that
was
has
going to ask you about that.
it has exactly to do
Yeah,
with power and what is legitimate. And so I guess I have an issue with, I guess the way pseudoscience is used uh, today. I think in my book, I make the claim that pseudoscience is essentially a four-letter word. It is, um, I mean, how would you say it's a pejorative, and like its
yeah.
main purpose is to shut down conversation. If something is pseudoscientific, you can't talk about it. And so, like for example, what was that like 19th century science about like brain shape, like phrenology, like
Phrenology. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
exactly. If,
Totally.
if if something is like pseudoscientific, it shuts down the conversation, and I think that's problematic. I think it's problematic because there's so many things that we need to talk about. And I think a large reason around this book is like creating new spaces to talk about, that which has been marginalized, that which has been rejected, that which has been forbidden because, the powers that be, whether they're ideological powers or scientific institutions, have said like, no, this thing, we have decided that this thing does not exist, therefore we can't talk about it. And at least as a humanities scholar, I'd say like there's a lot of interesting histories there that we can talk about scientific history, literary history, histories of power that are really important to think about. And so, to that extent, I'm trying to push back around at least like kind of like the aura of the pseudoscientific and trying to peel away from the idea that these are the subjects and the objects that we can no longer talk about it because they've been deemed irrelevant or false. I mean, even the term pseudoscience, it comes from the Latin pseudos, which means false or sham.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so the idea is like this doesn't rise to the level of scientific inquiry, so we're not going to talk about it. And I think that's one of the major reasons why I created this new term, parascience. And so
Yeah.
parascience was, I guess, a way for me to talk about pseudoscience in broader terms. And so I guess just for those who haven't read the book yet, parascience I define as the realm of knowledge just outside of establishment science. And
Yeah.
it's in this realm of knowledge where rejected or marginalized ideas often come into contact with new literatures, with myth, with philosophy, both Western and non-Western, as well as new scientific developments. And it's in this weird milieu that they can take on new forms and regenerate and often come back into mainstream conversation. And it's this way that, quote unquote, pseudoscientific ideas can gain new life. They gain new traction. And it explains why they can persist long after they've been deemed as not true by establishment science.
Yeah. Once they've been rejected. But as we were talking before the show, there is a danger in the whole propagation of some pseudoscience, as we've seen culturally, right? I mean, I think it's fair to say that in some regards, the GOP today is an anti-science party. I don't want to get too political, but I think that I can make that claim, even though some of my audience may not like it. But I want to read a quote from the book that I think touches on this. And it's rather long, so I apologize, but I think it touches on this point. Quote, to be clear, the book is not a celebration of conspiracy theories, alternative facts, post-truth propaganda, or their ilk. As we know all too well, this kind of information has devastating material effects, from tobacco industry cancer research to refuting public health data during the COVID-19 pandemic. Heterodoxy has been willfully deployed by politicians and organizations alike to society's detriment. These are serious epistemic problems that require serious pushback, but challenging oddball ideas requires discussing them. It demands contextualizing and historicizing by tracing origins, proponents, and patterns. While I would argue psi belongs to a different category of outsider science than, say, anti-vax campaigns, my larger point holds. Such issues warrant meaningful, sustained critique. The problem is that psi is not covered in the academy enough, as if evading it will simply make it go away. For a cultural object as multifaceted and protean as the paranormal mind, understanding its longitudinal permutations informs us about the nature of anomalous epistemology. Rather than pretend pseudoscience does not exist, the time has come to study its circulation, evolution, and dissemination. Moreover, we must continue the task of estranging the paranormal, of recognizing the ubiquity of supernatural phenomenon in global contexts, and exploring its myriad logics. Thoughts? What are you going for there? I mean, I think that you nail it right on the head, but we're living in a moment where, um, I'm all for and I'm passionate about defending ideas that have been previously rejected and may not be on the surface. I don't think humanity has, near as much figured out as it thinks it does. I think mystery is alive and well. At the same time, that is not an excuse for turning every scientific argument into a post-truth kind of dilemma where anything goes because I only want what's going to advance my, long-term goal, whether economically, culturally, racially, sexually, any of that stuff. It's like we have to have some standards, but I think that the paradigms have gotten claustrophobic. Where do we find that balance? How do we begin to like open up the dialogue with while still protecting ourselves against the vector of disinformation?
Yeah, so I think you nailed the head. You nailed it right in the head. I think like there's a fine needle to thread, especially in this political moment. I think like there's been a lot of um, yeah, I guess the way that I would say it is that we have to proceed carefully. Like obviously, there's been a lot of times when I guess like bad science has arisen. Like so I think like the anti-cancer science research by the tobacco corporations in the 70s is proof positive of that where they actually had the data and just like misconstrued it or lied about it to prove that cigarettes were perfectly healthy. So I think like there's that, but then you've got like something like psi, and I think it's very different. And I so like the reason why I approach this, I think a lot of things get lumped under the moniker of pseudoscientific, and I think there is a spectrum. In the terms of psi, like I guess like for example, if we compare this with like anti-vax campaigns, you can make an argument that it's like it's a movement that is using science, to back or like it's like either like I try to identify science, to back its claims versus psi, which is it's using science to understand personal experience, is using science to understand phenomena that we can't figure out just yet. And I think there's difference between that personal and political valence. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and
absolutely.
so, and I think what I am advocating for more than anything else is just open-mindedness, especially in the academy. I think like the general public is broad enough that a lot of ideas that the academy isn't going to look at are openly discussed. But the academy has lost a certain level of openness. And I might here distinguish between like the sciences and the humanities. The humanities have done a really good job, I'd say, over the years of being open to different interpretations. Has always been interested in the occult and the social and the psychological experiences behind that. The sciences have been a little bit less willing to look into the paranormal. There's something about enlightenment reasoning and positivism, where everything is an unbiased inquiry that produces absolute truth. It creates harder lines, and so hopefully this book can help change the minds of humanists who would not give the paranormal the time of day. But maybe if you're a scientist and you think, maybe we've been too harsh to shut down like anything that has to do with the paranormal. And like there's been, if you read the book, like there's a lot of methods by which academic journals will just like receive any sort of supernatural or psi research and just shuttle it out the door, give it a death rejection, because this is something that we're not even going to entertain. So hopefully my book can change some minds and say like this is something that's worth discussing and think about and engaging in some way.
Uh, in the book, you talk about also how the study of the paranormal has historically been more inclusive than a lot of other subjects, and that maybe it's a aspect as an outsider kind of knowledge stream means that it's more open to people who typically aren't represented in other kinds of debates. But can you talk a little bit about how the faces of the paranormal discussion often are a little bit, less representative of the sort of white, you know, hegemony than other subjects might
Yeah,
be,
I
and
mean the
why
thing
that's the
is
case.
you're exactly right. I mean, like psychical research. So basically, for people who don't know, the Society for Psychical Research was looking at paranormal phenomena. Psychical research got a new term, parapsychology, around the middle of the 20th century. But psychical research and parapsychology has always been more welcoming to outsiders because it is by definition an outsider science. It has always existed outside of the correct methodologies and the major fields. And so everyone who's been involved in this discipline from the very beginning knows what it feels like to be marginalized. And to
Yeah,
that extent, it has opened its doors to people who have not always had their access to the power of science. And this goes back to the very beginning. The psychical researchers needed mediums to understand spectral communication. And so they brought women into the laboratory. uh, and you needed, and at the time it was believed that women were simply more sensitive than men. And so they made for the best mediums. I mean, they can read minds better than men could. They can speak to the dead better than men could. And so, bringing, so there's a gender angle to this. And likewise, I think, be entertaining people who believed in astral travel and demonology and magic. And, these were the things that might get you laughed out of the ivory tower, but psychical researchers who were in many instances citizen scientists were completely open to that. And they said, there's no way we're going to learn how precognition or spirit communication works without people who can think outside the box. And so this welcoming of outsider thinking, I think, is part and parcel of paranormal discourse, and something that I want parascience to centralize, to centralize the marginal.
Yeah. Another interesting aspect of that whole outsider thing, I think, is that part of like science as an institution, in universities and institutions across the country or whatever, they want to make hard and fast, decisions about what's real and what's not with the pseudoscience label and other ways. But at the same time, our academia is trying to become more culturally permissive in terms of including other groups and other, um, you know, uh, uh, whatever social milieus besides the Western scientific canon. So there's an inclusive urge, while at the same time, some of those groups that they'd want to include have ideologies and mindsets that are more permissive towards the paranormal.
Mhm.
Um, it seems like that's a delicate line to trod. And how do you think the universities are doing, and what could they do better there? I mean, like for instance, in Native American cultures, a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of parapsychology are standard fare, or in African tribal cultures, the same sorts of thing. How can we it seems like there's a contradiction there in trying to be more inclusive, but also still maintaining some of the hard and fast rules of what's pseudoscience or what's not. It's like, yeah, we'll let you have the conversation, but what you believe is not true. I mean,
Yeah, no,
making
it's
those
funny
determinations is weird.
as you were talking, it reminded me of a story. Like one of the reasons I wrote this book had to do with how we think about ghosts. And as I was not an English major in undergrad, but I certainly read a lot of books. And as I got further into my graduate studies, you start reading about ghosts. You read the scholarship about ghosts, and you learn it gets hammered into your head. A ghost is a symbol for something else. A ghost is a symbol for trauma, or a ghost is a symbol for guilt. And the thing that didn't jive with me was like my mom told me ghost stories. She grew up in Rangoon, Burma. And she's like, well, ghosts are real. Ghosts
Yeah,
are specters. I saw a ghost and like it woke me up in the middle of the night. And so the idea that like ghosts aren't just like things to be explained away or just symbol for something else, but like are entities within certain people's worldviews and entire cultures have like explanations for how ghosts exist.
yeah.
And so that permissibility that you're talking about is increasing. I don't think it's quite,
Where it
ubiquitous
needs to
just
be or
yet.
whatever. Yeah.
I mean, I think like certainly like if you look at the scholarship from a couple of years ago, like any Native American ghost or any Asian American ghost is explained as a way as something else. But I think at least one of the things I'm trying to do in my book is, well, let's look at how these cultures understand ghosts, right? And so, for example, in the chapter I have about Asian American ghosts, we talk about qi and the idea that
Hmm.
qi in Chinese philosophy is this universal element that can take both soft and hard forms, yin and yang. And it is a system for understanding how ghosts can exist after the passing of the human body. I also talk about Korean shamanism, and that is part of ancient Korean culture, and the idea that after you pass away, um, ghosts can stick around, especially if they're unhappy, and you can channel them into your body and communicate with the living. And that's just part of the ontological and epistemological framework. And so, given that we are increasingly moving away from a Eurocentric hegemonic I guess, educational platform and looking at how do other cultures and societies see the world, it's important to understand how do they also see the afterlife, ghosts. How can they explain divine visions?
Yeah.
And like broadening our expanse and authorizing other worldviews and allowing others to speak is super important to understanding the history of ideas.
Yeah. And I think also, like, I mean, including those ideas broadens our own vocabulary for what's available for us. I mean, like I mentioned before, the meta crisis, we're living in a moment that's so fraught with all of these problems. I mean, not to say that we need to embrace a paranormal solution, but there are currents in those oceans of thought that maybe we can, deploy to help us kind of figure out ways to get beyond the immediate problems we're facing. And if we're closing those off, then I think we're only doing ourselves harm. And that sort of brings me to the other question about like, one of the main concerns you have or the research points of the book is the longevity of it. How does it keep surviving despite the fact that it's been shut down over and over again? And
Mhm.
part of me, one of the I think the crisis of science right now is that people feel like there's scientific authorities that decide what's true and what's not, and sometimes the dictates that come from those authorities go against people's everyday experience, right?
Mhm.
Like they experience life in and out, and they have these moments where they have a precognitive dream. Or they have something happen that sort of hints at some kind of whether it's a deep synchronicity or a coincidence, or they, have a spiritual kind of experience where they feel like they belong to a greater whole. Those are very powerful transformative experiences. And if science doesn't offer any place for those kinds of things, then people will reject science rather than reject the evidence of their own senses. Do you think that that may have something to do with that longevity? And what other currents do you think that you identified
Yeah,
that play into
so
that?
part of my argument about like what are the drivers around parascience, like what allows rejected ideas to perpetuate, and I basically say that I make the claim that there are two major engines behind that. One is surprisingly science itself. And so
Yeah,
I think this might come as a surprise to listeners. Like, how can science be the engine behind pseudoscience? But the historical record shows, like, time and again, there are new developments, new theories, new experiments that allow people who are interested in parapsychology and psychology to say that explains how precognition works.
mhm,
This new development from the field of physics explains how I was able to see this in a dream. So basically, there's new scientific developments that are happening all the time that empower rejected ideas back into mainstream thought to give them new life. And I can give like multiple examples of that
sure.
in a second. The
Okay.
other driver I say is literature.
Yeah, yeah,
So, literature is often is a way to do science through another means. The laboratory, test tube, and the microscope are not the only ways to do scientific cogitation. So much of the paranormal and what we would call psi phenomena cannot be studied in the laboratory. And so I think scientists and other writers, thinkers have recognized the limits of science. And so they use fiction, nonfiction, memoirs to think through scientific ideas. And like there's a good track record of science fiction thinking through, how can we explain psychic phenomena, through X means. And I'm going to use this novel to explain that. And these ideas gain traction and then perpetuate over time. So I guess I give one example is the citron. So one of my chapters is about precognition and how it was reinvigorated by quantum physics, especially 1950s quantum physics, when they suddenly realized there are all these particles like neutrinos that we cannot see. And then the idea of like faster than light particles might exist. And if such particles could exist, that would explain precognition. Faster than light thought might explain how we're able to see the future in some way. And so this idea, which starts off as like a scientific concept, gets sutured to age-old precognition, and then that gets taken up by Philip K. Dick, who writes about it in his novels, and it gets taken up in comic books like Watchmen, where Dr. Manhattan can see the future via tachyons, which are faster than light
tachyons.
particles.
Yeah, totally.
And so I'm tracing this weird lineage of how age-old ideas get reinvigorated by science itself, and then literature does the scientific thinking about how is this possible, and what are the possible ramifications. So, for example, in one of Philip K. Dick's novels called Valis, you
So
can
I've
see the
read. I love
future,
it. Yeah,
but you can definitely see the future. But if you see it too much, it's gonna like burn a hole in your brain because it's like a microwave.
yeah.
So, yeah. So like I think that's one example. Probably my favorite chapter in the book was the Project Stargate chapter,
And
and
it's interesting because I just interviewed one of the original participants in Project Stargate. So,
Really?
yeah, yeah. Anyway, go ahead. I want to hear what
Oh,
you have to say.
so in that chapter, I was using I was looking at basically the revival of clairvoyance, and clairvoyance is the ability to see distant objects. And so that is an idea that has been around for quite a long time. It had been rejected by mainstream science as something that was not possible. But then it got revived in the 1970s because the US military complex suddenly had a very vested interest in the ability to see distant objects and specifically Cold War targets. What if we could find psychics who could look at what's happening at a Russian missile base? What is happening with that Chinese nuclear test? Could we use psychics to look at hidden documents inside some foreign secretary's office? And so basically, I talk about how this psychic Ingo Swann got the right military connections and developed this psychic super soldier program, which eventually became Project Stargate. And he said, like, I can train people to look across the world. And the really amazing thing was Ingo Swann kept pristine records. And so I was able to go into his archive and read the notes that he made. I read the instruction manuals he wrote for the CIA. And he has explanations for how his new method, which he called remote viewing, operates and how it taps into this cosmic unconscious to reveal geographic data. It is like wild, crazy stuff that you would not believe unless you actually saw it. And like I was like looking at these pages and like couldn't believe that no one else had looked too closely at this stuff previously.
Yeah,
And so, and earlier you were talking about like liberal and progressive views, but like, like the military had huge like. I mean, the thing is, I think like this transcends politics. I mean,
yeah, totally, totally.
I think like there was a huge like interest in beating the Russians at the psychic warfare game. And
Yeah,
like the funny thing was the reason why the US funded this Project Stargate was because they were sure that the Russians had their own psychic program, which they did. And
yeah.
so they talk about that as well. And so like there was this psychic arms race that was happening around the middle of the century. And the US obviously wanted to win it, so you might as well fund this guy to train some spies to spy on Russia.
Yeah. It's interesting though that what you just point to is a major factor in the propagation of these ideas, the government. I mean, like the Stargate program. Okay, for people who may have been on the fence about psi abilities, the fact that the government spent millions of dollars to do research on it. So for some people, they're like, well, the government's not going to waste $20 million on psychic programs unless it's real. The UFO program. There has been lots of activity around UFOs in the government for many, many years. Whether or not, I mean, the bona fides of that could be debated, but there has been attention paid by the government on these things. So the role the government plays in sort of continuing these ideas is very interesting. And if you say that all of those things, are sort of a mirage or a pseudoscience, I mean, does the government have a vested interest in kind of maintaining these ideas, or are they just a side effect of like, extreme strategic thoroughness and trying to like exhaust every possibility of weaponization? I wonder.
That's a really good question. I mean, I do think at the end of the day, if you had a Psy warrior, it just practically makes a lot of sense. Let's be honest.
Yeah, 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 for
Uh,
sure.
and so I think, I guess like. I guess the question that you're asking is like, what is the role of government in perpetuating these psi ideas? And um, I think like science is not this neutral uh, form of knowledge. I think it depends on funding, it depends
Yes,
on power, it depends on
yes, exactly.
institutions.
Hmm.
And if the government decides that psychical research or parapsychology gives us some strategic advantage, we'd better do it. And
Yeah.
it's practical insofar that it was way cheaper than sending a satellite into space, and that satellite can't even look inside a building. It's
Yeah.
also safer than sending a spy to infiltrate a building because that person's life is at risk. Let's just pay for a dozen soldiers to hang out in Fort Meade uh, in Maryland and just like think about what is in another room on the other side of the planet and then get that information. It makes both economic sense and strategic sense.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that struck me when you were talking about the role that fiction plays in science, or like that it's not only in a laboratory where developments get made. I mean, it made me think of like Einstein's thought experiments, right? And a lot of science fiction could be thought of as early conceptual thought experiments about different technologies and whatnot. Can you talk a little bit about the role of the imagination, both in the occult and in the cultural stream for promoting science developments, and
Yeah.
how we want to encourage that, even though maybe we want to be careful about what pseudoscience we underline as, you know,
Exactly. I've thought a lot about this, and like there are definitely thoughts about this in the book. And I'll talk specifically about science fiction because it works particularly well for definitely think about science and society. I mean, I think like the function of science fiction has been debated for decades. Ever since this genre really took off throughout the 20th century, and so. Hugo Gernsback, who is the great editor of Amazing Stories, um, he believed that science fiction serves a pedagogical purpose. Its job is to train young readers in scientific concepts to hopefully, help them become better inventors, better engineers going forward. This contrasted with another editor, um, John Campbell, who is the editor of Astounding, and he said, no, no, no. Science fiction plays an ethical function. It helps us think through what science will do to society because scientists aren't doing it. They're just releasing technologies
right?
into the world and seeing what happens. I mean, I think like
And this
social
is after
media.
and this is after Hiroshima and after the bomb, right? So like that's what they were. Yeah, that's
Exactly. Like,
amazing.
let's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
release the bomb, see what happens. And like, we have different bombs today, like the cell phone. How has that transformed social relations and information now? Social
yeah.
media. Like,
Social media. Yeah,
we have the IT companies have like just run an experiment on American teenagers for the past 10 years. And so like, John Campbell would say science fiction is important because it helps us think about the ethics of technology. What does releasing this instrument or this science do to society and how we relate to each other? And then I make the claim in my book that science can also have an epistemological function. It helps us create knowledge. It helps us think about scientific knowledge and create scientific knowledge where science cannot go or will not go. Again, as I mentioned, there are things that science just cannot test just yet. Like psi phenomena is sporadic, and you just can't summon it at any given moment. You don't know when you're going to have a divine vision, and so like it doesn't lend itself to a laboratory experiment, but at least we can like think through it through literature. And so I think these phases of the pedagogical, the ethical, and the epistemological all point to the different things that fiction and literature can do, and how it promotes and disseminates scientific thinking.
I love it. That's great. So I'm wondering. I mean, you just published this book. When did it come out?
It came out this month. It
Okay.
is coming. It either came out probably like this past week. I got a couple advance copies early in the
Yeah.
month, so I don't know when the official release date was, but it's definitely August 2025.
Okay. Have you gotten any feedback from your colleagues or students? Do you expect to? Is there a class coming up at Wake Forest that might deal with some of this material? And if so, are you nervous about that? What do you think? You've been outed as someone who at least entertains these notions. So,
Well, it's funny. I've always gotten good feedback from my colleagues. It's
yeah,
funny when I was interviewing for jobs a couple of years ago, I was actually scared to bring up this topic. It was so out of left field. It was certainly like within science studies. Well, I guess like there's just no jobs for like in the paranormal, as like
Yeah,
in the job descriptor,
yeah,
and so I was usually bringing up the more traditional stuff, but for this job, I decided to just like I just said screw it, I'm gonna like show them the best stuff I've got,
yeah,
and they received it really well, and I think of all the things I ever like talk about, like this is a thing that other faculty members across the university want to talk to me about, and students want to talk to me about. Because I think science doesn't explain everything. Like everybody
yeah,
knows someone who has seen a ghost. Everyone knows someone who saw a flash of the future and it came true.
yeah,
There are things that science can't explain, and there's something about the paranormal that has traction. And so to that extent, I'm not too afraid about what people will how they will respond. I try to be pretty rigorous in terms of tracking where these ideas came from,
yeah.
and at the very least, the idea, like the ultimate argument that like let's be open-minded about these weird things that are inexplicable, but let's talk about them as opposed to shutting it down. And I feel it's hard to at least argue against that kind of argument.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. I mean, it's all about inclusion. And like you said, these ideas aren't going anywhere. And at a major American university, that's the thing that people want to talk to you the most about, says something about how alive and well those ideas are within the institution, even though it's not, maybe on the class schedule. It's something that's perking a lot of people's interest, which is important.
Right.
Is this something that you're going to continue? Do you see another direction for, another project, or are you just going to rest on this for a few minutes? Because I know it was a lot of work. Where are you at
Yeah.
with that?
So I do want to. I think like there's different paths I've been considering. Like obviously, I haven't. I feel like once you get into like the paranormal rabbit hole, you figure out there's like so many more avenues to go down. And so, on one hand, there's a lot of stuff around remote viewing that like I would love to pursue further if I had more time. Um, but I guess like maybe the thing that I've been thinking about more broadly is just um, where does paranormal stuff fit within the larger ecosystem of conspiracy theories, information, disinformation,
Yeah,
misinformation? I'm really interested in what counts as truth these days. So I guess like it's a bit more of like in an abstract term, but I am interested, like given how conspiracy theory has like taken off in the last couple of years, and I think it really is. And the thing is, like I feel like it conspiracies are interesting, and the thing is, like I don't try. I'm not saying this in a pejorative or negative way. I think like
yeah,
conspiracies are fascinating, and there are true conspiracies and false conspiracies, and it all is like this weird muddle of like what counts as truth, who gets to determine truth. Um, I think like one avenue I'm possibly thinking of is like, how does some of this parapsychological, psychical stuff fit into the realm of conspiracy? What does this tell us about the function of truth and what society wants at this given moment? I think that might be like an interesting direction. And I guess to put a pin on it, like I'm interested in conspiracy literature, and what does that tell us about what society believes about science, post-truth, anti-science in any given moment.
yeah. I think that that is one of the most important questions we could be talking about right now, honestly, in this subject and others, because we're wrestling with how we substantiate, arguments that have everything to do with where we're going and where we've been and what's going to happen in the next, few years. And if we don't come to terms with what we think of truth and how we gate that, things could get dark. So
Yeah,
would love to have you back on the show and talk about that in the future if that comes up. So
absolutely. Well, this was a pleasure. It was a great conversation, and
yeah, absolutely, man.
yeah.